You're sitting in your car outside your own house, engine off, having just gotten the email confirming your new salary, a number that would have seemed genuinely unbelievable to the version of you 5 years ago, a 40% increase from where you started, and you notice, reading it a second time to make sure you're not misreading it, that the feeling in your chest isn't the one you expected. You expected relief. You expected something closer to arrival, the specific, settled satisfaction of having finally caught up to a life you've been chasing for years. What you actually feel, sitting there in the driveway, is a strange, immediate recalculation, your mind already running toward the next number instead of resting in this one, already comparing this new salary not to where you started, but to a completely different, higher benchmark you hadn't even consciously been tracking until this exact moment, the income of a specific coworker, Holloway, who joined the company 2 years after you and somehow, through a role change you don't fully understand, is almost certainly making more than this new number of yours already. You catch yourself doing this math within about 90 seconds of receiving genuinely excellent news, and something about the speed of the shift bothers you more than the comparison itself does. You'd have expected, 5 years ago, that a 40% raise would feel like enough, at least for a little while. Instead, it feels like you've simply been handed a new, more expensive room to stand in, from which an entirely new set of taller people are suddenly visible. The specific cruelty of earning more is rarely about the money itself. It's about the almost instantaneous, involuntary way your brain recalibrates its comparison group the moment your own circumstances change, ensuring that no matter how far you climb, there's always a newly visible ceiling exactly one rung above wherever you've just arrived. This is the part almost nobody explains honestly, because most financial content treats income growth as a simple, linear satisfaction machine: earn more, feel better, repeat, and almost none of it prepares you for the specific, disorienting experience of genuine, measurable progress somehow producing the exact same feeling of falling behind that you were supposedly trying to escape in the first place. You mention this feeling to your older sister, Odalise, a few weeks later, expecting her to tell you you're being ungrateful, and instead she laughs, not unkindly, and tells you something that reframes the entire problem for you. "That's not new," she says. "That's just the first time you've actually felt it happen fast enough to notice. It's been happening your whole life. You just never had a raise big enough, delivered fast enough, to catch it in the act." She's right, and once she says it, you can trace the exact same pattern backward through your entire adult life, each time disguised as something else. At 24, your reference group was your college friends, and the specific satisfaction of your first real job's salary lasted almost exactly as long as it took you to notice which of them had landed higher-paying jobs than you had. At 29, your reference group had quietly shifted to coworkers at your own level, the satisfaction of a promotion lasting until you noticed someone in a parallel role getting promoted slightly faster. Each time, the specific comfort of enough evaporated within weeks, not because the money itself stopped being real, but because the goalposts moved automatically, silently, the moment your own position in the field changed. Your reference group isn't a fixed target you're trying to catch. It's a moving one that updates itself automatically the instant your own circumstances shift, which means the sensation of almost there is structurally, mathematically incapable of ever resolving into arrive, no matter how much actual progress you make, because arrival simply relocates the comparison rather than satisfying it. The mechanism gets a name for you a few months later, in a conversation with a behavioral economist a friend introduces you to at a dinner party, who explains something that finally organizes the whole pattern into language you can actually use. She tells you about a specific, well-documented phenomenon researchers call reference group neglect, the human tendency, when evaluating your own progress, to unconsciously benchmark against whichever peer group feels most immediately relevant, rather than against your own past self, a comparison that would actually reflect your real progress accurately. The problem, she explains, is that as your own circumstances improve, your peer group automatically updates too, shifting from people genuinely similar to your starting point toward people who represent your new, higher position, a group that, almost by definition, always contains someone doing slightly better than you within it. It's not a flaw in your character, she tells you, watching you process this. It's a structural feature of how comparison works. The only way out isn't earning enough to finally beat the reference group. It's noticing that the reference group itself is the actual trap, and choosing, deliberately, which one you're going to measure yourself against instead of letting it update automatically. The specific mechanism keeping you feeling behind despite real progress isn't a lack of success. It's an automatic, largely unconscious process that keeps swapping your comparison group for a slightly more advantaged one every time your own life improves, guaranteeing that the feeling of catching up remains permanently, structurally out of reach unless you interrupt the automatic swap on purpose. You test this directly, a few weeks after that dinner party, by doing something you've never consciously done before, deliberately choosing your reference group instead of letting it default to whoever happens to be nearby. You pull up your own financial numbers from 5 years earlier, the actual figures, side by side with today's, and you make yourself sit with the comparison for a full 10 minutes, refusing to let your mind drift toward Holloway or anyone else currently occupying the automatic, unconscious comparison slot. The actual numbers are startling in a way the ongoing, automatic comparison had never let you register clearly. Your savings have more than tripled, your debt is nearly eliminated, your actual quality of life, measured against your own past rather than anyone else's present, has improved more dramatically over 5 years than you'd ever let yourself fully appreciate. Because you never once actually run this specific comparison before. You notice something shift, sitting with these numbers, a real, physical loosening in your chest that the raise itself, 3 weeks earlier, had never quite delivered, and you understand, doing this exercise, that the actual problem was never insufficient progress. It was an almost complete absence of ever measuring the progress against the only comparison that could have ever actually satisfied you, your own trajectory, rather than someone else's current position. Comparing yourself to your own past, rather than to whoever's currently one rung ahead of you, produces a completely different emotional result from the exact same set of facts, because your past self is the only comparison point that actually holds still long enough to be caught up to, rather than perpetually relocating itself the moment you get close. Your friend Marchetti, from an earlier chapter of your life, genuinely wealthy, several generations deep, teaches you something unexpected about this exact trap the next time you see him, because you assume, going in, that his level of financial security must have made him immune to it entirely, and you're surprised to learn otherwise. He tells you, over drinks, about his own version of the identical pattern, playing out at a scale that would seem absurd from where you're standing, comparing his family's holdings not to people struggling the way you once did, but to other families in his own specific social tier, a tier so far removed from ordinary financial concerns that the comparisons themselves sound almost surreal described out loud. Whose family foundation is larger, whose children attend which specific schools, a whole ecosystem of status anxiety running at a completely different altitude but structurally identical to the exact feeling you'd been having about your own 40% raise. It never stops. He tells you, with a specific, resigned honesty you hadn't expected from him. You'd think it would, at some point. It doesn't. The number just gets bigger and the people you're comparing yourself to get further from anything either of us would call normal. You realize, listening to him, that the mechanism isn't actually about income level at all. It runs identically at every altitude, from your first job out of college to Marchetti's family foundation, because the trap was never really about the specific dollar figure. It was always about the automatic, involuntary comparison process itself, a process that follows you upward indefinitely unless you deliberately intervene in it, regardless of how high you climb. The comparison trap doesn't have an income level where it naturally stops. It runs identically at every altitude, from your first raise to a family fortune several generations deep, because the actual mechanism was never about the specific number at all. It's about an automatic process that keeps recruiting new comparison points indefinitely, unless you interrupt it deliberately, on purpose, at whatever level you currently happen to be standing. You start, deliberately, after the conversation with Marchetti, building a specific conscious practice around this, a quarterly check-in, alone, with the actual numbers from your own past rather than anyone else's present, a habit you treat with the same seriousness you treat any other financial discipline, because you've come to understand that managing your comparison group is, in its own way, just as real a skill as managing your actual money. You notice, doing this consistently over the following year, that the specific, automatic recalculation toward Holloway and people like him doesn't fully disappear. You don't expect it to, having heard Marchetti's version of the same story, but it loses some of its immediate, involuntary grip, replaced increasingly by a genuine, steady satisfaction in your own trajectory that the raise alone had never managed to produce on its own. You catch yourself, at a work event months later, hearing about a colleague's promotion, and noticing the old reflex start to fire, and instead of following it automatically the way you always had before, you deliberately redirect it, running the comparison against your own numbers from a year earlier instead, and the specific, sharp edge of falling behind anxiety simply doesn't arrive the way it always used to. The actual fix was never earning enough to finally silence the comparison. It was building a specific, deliberate habit of choosing which comparison to run, on purpose, every single time the automatic one tries to fire, a discipline that has to be practiced continuously, the same way any other habit does, rather than achieved once and then permanently resolved. You're back in your car outside your own house, a full year after that first strange, disappointing raise, having just received another one, smaller this time, a modest 8% increase that would have felt, a year earlier, almost insulting by comparison to the previous year's 40% jump. You notice the old reflex try to fire, the automatic reach toward Holloway, toward whoever's currently one rung ahead, and you catch it, deliberately, the way you've been practicing for months now, and you pull up your own numbers instead, the actual comparison against your own past self, and you sit with the real math for a few minutes, the way you did that first time at the dinner party's suggestion. And you feel something settle in your chest that the 40% raise, delivered a full year earlier with far more fanfare, had never quite managed to deliver on its own. Earning more will never, on its own, catch you up to a reference group that updates itself automatically the moment your own life improves. The only actual finish line available in this specific race is the one you build yourself, deliberately, by choosing, on purpose, every single time the automatic comparison tries to fire, to measure your progress against the only version of yourself that was ever actually running the same race you started.